Well, great.
Good morning, everyone. It is Friday, October 29th, 2021. This is American Studies 301 and a couple of other classes thrown in at the University of Idaho, which looked like my virtual backdrop until about 3 days ago. And then we've had heavy rain since then, and a lot of the leaves have fallen since then. And the timing couldn't be better to have our guest with us today as the leaders of the world gather in Glasgow, Scotland next week for the climate conference known as COP26. And climate is in the news almost every day with the efforts to get President Biden's Build Back Better plan, which includes a lot of attention to climate change, to get that through Congress. And our guest is uniquely poised to talk about this as a former 5-term member of Congress in actually 2 non-consecutive periods. So Bob Inglis, the executive director of RepublicEn.org, first elected to U.S. Congress in 1992 after having never before run for public office. And he represented the Greenville-Spartanburg area of South Carolina from 1993 to 98. He made an unsuccessful run to unseat a Democratic U.S. Senator in 1998. And I'd like to think that if, Bob, if you'd won that year, you'd still be in the Senate and maybe talking sense to some of your Republican colleagues there. He ran again for the House in 2004 and served 3 terms until losing in the Republican primary in 2010. He was primaried primarily because of his views on climate change, and that's another story for another day. But in 2010, Inglis went full-time into promoting free enterprise action on climate change, launching the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, which became RepublicEn in 2014. And just for a little background on the group, it's a growing grassroots community of more than 10,000 Americans educating the country about free enterprise solutions to climate change. For his work on climate change, he received the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award in 2015. And if you've seen the film Merchants of Doubt and the Showtime series Years of Living Dangerously, you've seen him on the small screen or on the big screen. And we're just delighted to have him with us for about 50 minutes today. And it's an honor to introduce my friend all the way from South Carolina, Bob Inglis. Welcome, Bob.
Well, Ken, thank you very much. It's great to be with you. I wish it could be in person and to have seen those leaves behind you there that in your backdrop. And great to see Karen here and Mac, and I've enjoyed being with you all in person before in Moscow. And so hopefully it's coming back soon that we can get together again. I think Tara Hudeberg is working on some things, cooking up some plans. So I hope that that happens. So I'm aware of there are a lot of things to talk about here. And it occurs to me that some of you have heard how I got to this, but not all have. So I probably should start by explaining that, because otherwise you have no idea how in the world did a conservative get all hepped up on climate. So I feel I need to explain that. And then maybe we could talk about this really pretty exciting opportunity in Glasgow and what I hope comes out of Glasgow. Those 2 things, and then we'll open up your questions and comments. Particularly interested in hearing your questions and any suggestions you want to make to us. So yes, for those who haven't heard, it is a conservative thing to be concerned about climate change. That's what we say at RepublicEn.org. It's actually sort of the opposite of conservatism to proceed pell-mell in the face of risk. Conservatism probably should go deeper than just your politics, might go to sort of a personality type, which is that, hey, let's be careful here. Let's not just throw caution to the wind and proceed pell-mell with all this risk being indicated by the science. So, we think it's conservative, but I realize that it sort of strikes some people as a little bit strange for conservatives to be working on climate change. But here's the way it was. For my first 6 years in Congress, I fit the bill. I said climate change is nonsense. All I knew was Al Gore was for it. I was against it. That was the end of the inquiry. Okay, so I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was for my first 6 years in Congress. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law here in Greenville, South Carolina. Had the opportunity to run for the same seat, as Kenton said, in 2004. That was the year my son, the eldest of our 5 kids, had just turned 18, so he was voting for the first time. And he came to me and said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. These people constitute a constituency, and a constituency that actually can change the locks on the doors to your house. So you need to respond to that constituency very carefully. And so that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. Step 2 was going to Antarctica and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. We can go into that if you want to in the Q&A time as to what that evidence is and how compelling it is. And then step 3 was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening at the Great Barrier Reef. Snorkeling with an Aussie climate scientist who I could see was worshiping God and what he was showing me. St. Francis of Assisi said, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." So Scott, without any words, was preaching the gospel. It was written all over his face. It was in his eyes. It was in the excitement of what he was showing me. I knew that he was worshiping God, not the corals. And so later we had a chance to talk. He told me about conservation changes he was making in his life to love God and love people. He rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning in Townsville, Australia, a pretty hot place, as long as his wife and 3 daughters will let him get away with it. Hangs the family's clothes out of the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. So I got real inspired by that. I wanted to be like Scott, who's now become a very dear friend. And I wanted to be like him in loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Probably not a very good idea in the midst of the Great Recession to be talking carbon taxes in probably the reddest district, the reddest state of the nation. And even while I'm saying that, I'm swallowing those words a little bit because you're in Moscow, Idaho, and maybe you might want to compete with me on that red thing. I don't know. Idaho is a pretty conservative place, but we're pretty conservative in South Carolina. So anyway, it didn't go well in that 2010 primary, and I got tossed out. A foundation came to me at that point and said, Inglis, pretty unusual, actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union lifetime rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, 0 with the Americans for Democratic Action, that's a liberal group, and 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO, the labor union. I was really hoping for a 0, actually. So they said, actual conservative. He says, climate change is real. Will you speak and write for the proposition? That's what I've been doing ever since. It's now this thing called RepublicEn.org. And we're a community of about 11,000 that needs to add a 0 or 2 on the end of that. And we'd love for you to join us. It takes about 45 seconds, probably. If you go to the site, RepublicEn.org, the join button will follow you wherever you go. And all you got to do is give us your name and zip code and email address, and we'll make you visible to your member of Congress and to your senators, because they're starting to get the memo that you exist. Conservatives who care about climate change. Back in the dark days when I was getting tossed out of Congress in 10, that wasn't a thing. People didn't think it was a thing. But now Republicans are starting to get it. They're starting to see that, you know what, especially young conservatives care about climate, just like their young progressive friends do. So join us. We need you. So that's how I got to this, and that's what we do at RepublicEn.org. That's the first thing I want to do here today. Second thing is to talk about what we can hope for out of Glasgow. And I have a very specific hope for what comes out of Glasgow, and that is progress on a carbon border adjustment. A what? Okay, so let me explain that maybe. It's like this. That carbon tax that I proposed in 2009 had two particular things about it that didn't help me in that 10 race, but it's starting to get through to conservatives that, you know, if you put on a carbon tax and you do two special things with it, one, you give the money back to the citizenry, either the way that Citizens Climate Lobby wants to do it, through a dividend or through corresponding tax cuts, say, for example, to the payroll tax, the FICA tax that you pay, whether you work at McDonald's or Microsoft. Those, by doing that tax cut or that refund through a dividend payment, you can make the tax revenue neutral. And that's government speak for, we're not going to take more of your money. Money's coming back to you. So we're just going to change what we tax. We're going to put a tax on carbon dioxide. So that was one special feature of it. The second special feature of the carbon tax that I was talking about is this border adjustment. And what that means is that if you have a country that is importing stuff into America and they don't have a carbon tax, we could impose our carbon tax on entry of their goods into an American port. We just collect the tax that they didn't collect internal to their own country. And then the tax money would be ours. Now, within 24 hours of that being upheld by the World Trade Organization, a country that's paying a tax on entry of its goods into America would probably develop their own carbon tax internal to their own country, because otherwise they're paying a tax on getting here that they could have collected in their own country, and then they wouldn't have paid that tax to America on the way coming into our market. So it makes it in their interest to follow our lead. It's not us doing some moral signaling and say, oh, don't you want to be wonderful people like us and have a carbon tax? No, it's a pretty bold commercial move that just says, no agreement, no bowing and scraping at the UN. It's just, we just tax your stuff, China, that's coming to our Walmart shelves. Oh, you don't like that? You sue us in the World Trade Organization. Well, we think you're going to lose. And after you lose in the World Trade Organization, because two good arguments. One is this is a content tax, and the WTO has upheld in the past content taxes. Sort of a chemical industry has precedents where you can base a tax based on the stuff coming in, the content of the goo, if you will. And this would be a carbon content tax. The second good argument is that we have a procedure or European countries especially have a procedure of a value-added tax that can then be removed on exports, imposed on imports, compliant with WTO rules. So we think it's going to be upheld by the World Trade Organization. And just consider what would happen when it's upheld. China, really 24 hours later, because they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus, you know, in China, they do the same thing. Why? Well, they just paid in an American port a tax that got sent to Washington. If they had collected that tax in China, those goods would have come through the American port with no adjustment. And the tax money would be in Beijing. So it becomes in their interest to do what we're doing. And then the whole world follows, because you're doing business anywhere in the world, you're doing business with the United States or with China. To give you an illustration of how this is getting through, consider Russia. I was on Foreign Affairs Committee, and we used to say that the way to understand Russia is it's not a country, it's an organized crime syndicate. So consider this: the organized crime syndicate that is Russia is considering a carbon tax. They announced this several weeks ago. Reason? Because they're getting ready to be paying a tax to the EU, the European Union. 2023, the EU plans to have a carbon border adjustment in place. And so, Russia has just built this great big pipeline, gas pipeline, for example, that's bringing natural gas from Russia into the EU. Well, this carbon tax would be collected at that pipeline on entry into the EU. And the tax money would end up at the EU. So Russia, a murderous organized crime syndicate, has figured out that, you know what? If we collected that tax ourselves, the gas would come through that Nord Stream pipeline with no adjustment. And we'd have the tax money here in Moscow, the other Moscow, rather than paying it over to the EU. And so here's my hope. If Russia, the organized crime syndicate, can see it's in its own interest to do a carbon tax, surely we can convince the U.S. Senate to do that. What it takes, though, is just a bipartisan action to get that going. And so I'm particularly excited that I hope that's what comes out of Glasgow, is some progress towards that, because the thing that's needed is some diplomacy to set up that border adjustment mechanism so that it's seamless and can be applied pretty easily. Because, of course, once a country adopts the same carbon tax, their goods would come in with no adjustment into the country that's would otherwise be imposing the tax. So if we can set this up through diplomacy, then we can really make the friction at the borders a lot less and make it so the goods come in pretty easily. And that's what we want, of course, because we want to trade with the world. And we just want them, though, to have the same carbon tax, because climate change is caused by emissions anywhere. Emissions anywhere are climate change everywhere. So we've got to get the whole world in on this thing. And so that's my hope for Glasgow. It actually also makes the strong case for a carbon tax, by the way, because the clearest way to get through that case that would be brought in the World Trade Organization against the carbon border adjustment is to have your own carbon tax. If you do, you're sitting pretty well for that case in the World Trade Organization. You're probably going to win it. But if you don't have your own carbon tax, it's a tougher case. It's a tougher argument to make that you can have your border adjustment. So let's hope that that's what a lot of the discussion centers around in Glasgow. So I've told you how I got to this, and have told you about my hope for Glasgow and what's going on here in the next couple of weeks. Let's see what questions or comments you have about these things or anything else.
Well, thank you for that brief overview. And I know that we have a number of conservative students in the class because of some of the issues that they've raised, as we've talked about the carbon tax or carbon fee and dividend program. And I would invite any of them to step forward, and you can put your question into chat, or just turn on your camera and mute yourself and ask in person.
And Kent, on that point, I might add this. some really interesting polling data out recently from the Climate Leadership Council. They did some polling in some sort of particularly close states. And what they found out is that 70% of Americans support this idea of a carbon border adjustment. And that support is on both sides of the aisle. It's Republicans and Democrats. It's conservative Republicans as well as more moderate Republicans, all sort of realizing, hey, that just makes sense. You know, you can't let China keep on sending their stuff to Walmart without applying the tax. And so Americans seem to get it, whether you're conservative or moderate or liberal, that, gee, that just makes sense, doesn't it?
I just found that climate leadership polling, and I'm going to put that into the chat if anybody wants to follow up on that later. But Sebastian, I see you've turned your camera on. Do you have a question for our guests?
Yeah, well, thank you, by the way, very much for joining us and joining us for the portion of our class this morning. So one of the questions that I've raised and we've had some discussion on is what the balance between sort of the government top-down structure should be and the industry kind of meeting halfway, because it seems to me that a lot of the times when you have government coming down and saying, this is what you need to do, you know, cut industry here, do this, it never lasts, and it always ends up doing more harm than good. So, and I watched your TEDx talks yesterday, and I noticed, and so I like the fact that what you're trying to do is say, okay, we want companies to bring this solution, right? So for example, when we look at the electric vehicle industry and how, like you said, there's a lot of people moving into seeing those benefits without the government having to had say anything so far. So yeah, that's my question is what, you know, how do you strike the correct balance between government top down and then industry?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it sets us up. You know, there are three ways to solve climate change. You can regulate carbon pollution. You can incentivize clean energy, or you can price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels. Really, it's just all the solutions fall into one of those three buckets. So you can regulate emissions. Well, we're not so big on that at RepublicEn.org, because that's regulation is often cumbersome, and it is that top-down thing you're talking about. But even if we weren't, you know, adverse to regulation, you know, we sort of break out in hives as conservatives when you talk about regulations. Even if we weren't that way, we'd realize the problem, the limitation of this first approach, which is you can't regulate Chinese emissions. And if you regulate here and you don't regulate, and they don't regulate there, manufacturers pick up and move from here to there. When they get there, they're going to emit more than they were emitting here, because we're way more energy efficient than China is. So you actually go downhill on solving climate change. You can feel morally superior by having, oh, well, we're clean here in America. We've got good regulations and we have fewer asthma cases. That would be good. And fewer hospital admissions. That'd be great. With pulmonary problems, that'd be terrific. But we wouldn't be solving worldwide climate change, because you got to get the world in. And if you just do it by regulating in America, you're not getting the world in yet. You're just regulating in America. So second approach is to incentivize clean energy. That's what's going to come out of this reconciliation bill pending in the Senate. If I were still in Congress, I'd be voting for some of those subsidies for wind and solar. In the meantime, until we can get to this best policy, it's an okay policy to give wind and solar credits. But there's the same limitation there that exists in the regulatory approach, which is how do you incentivize Chinese corporations or Indian corporations do the same thing we're doing here? Well, you can't. you can incentivize American corporations through the US tax code because they pay American taxes, but you can't incentivize other countries' companies through the American tax code. And so you run into the same limitation in that second approach that you had in the first one. So the third approach, obviously the one we favor, since we're saving it for last year, is you just price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels through a carbon tax, through a price on carbon dioxide, and then watch free enterprise sort it out themselves. A little bit like the way that BMW presented it to me. You know, BMW came to South Carolina like about 1994. I think they have about $7 billion now on the ground in Spartanburg, South Carolina. They make some very fine cars there. BMW means Bubba makes wheels. That's why they came here. You know, that's why. So anyway, they told me when I was first in Congress, they said, listen, please tell South Carolina EPA not to attempt to regulate how we paint a BMW. And they told me, we can assure you that we know better than anybody in the world how to paint a car. It's like 17 coats of paint on the hood of a BMW or something crazy. And so they said, just tell us how many parts per million we can emit, and we will engineer it down to that. And that's what we're talking about here in this third approach, is you just give the price signal, or you give a number to a company like ExxonMobil, and they'll say, got it, we'll figure it out from here. But if you come to them and you say, here's how to paint a BMW. We got some great engineers here at South Carolina EPA, and they're going to tell you how to paint that BMW. That don't work. That don't work for BMW. BMW wants to paint the car in a very special way. And so it's the idea of either prescriptive regulation, that's the first one I mentioned, or a price signal, which is that third approach. And as conservatives, we think that third approach is really superior. It's the one that makes it so that free enterprise says, yeah, got it. Okay, we're moving on. And at that point, what happens is clean becomes cheaper. The dirty has all of its expenses exposed because now they're built into the price of the product. And so someday you might go to the shelves of the grocery store and you're choosing between the plastic forks or the wooden forks, you know, for a party you're having. Well, there's some Georgia timber farmers who would like to make those wooden forks. And since they're a renewable resource, it might just, once you get all this sorted out, you might see that the wood spoon is actually cheaper than the plastic one. And you, the consumer, chooses that spoon in the liberty of enlightened self-interest because you're looking to save your money. And then we've got something going on, rather than somebody telling you, oh, no, you can't have a plastic spoon. No, you can have one if you want to, just pay for it, pay the full cost of it. But you might start choosing the wooden spoon because you'd say, hey, these from Georgia are actually cheaper. And then that's pretty exciting if you're a Georgia tree farmer, you know? And nobody told you what to do. That's what we'd like to stress as conservatives, is nobody's telling you what to do. You can choose, you make your own choices. It's just, once you see how expensive dirty is, we'll all start choosing cleaner, just because it makes sense.
We have a question from Professor Humes in the chat, but before I go to that, I wanted to see if any of the students wanted to jump in with a question or a comment on what you've heard so far. Seeing no hands, I'll go ahead and read the question. Congressman, how do you see the EU cap and trade system, as well as the California cap and trade program and other emissions trading systems, fitting in with carbon tax plans?
Yeah, I think that they can fit very well, particularly in the EU case. And California has a special thing that I'll mention, but you know, I'm real big on a carbon tax because I think it's simpler than a cap and trade system. But I would acknowledge that a well-designed carbon tax and a well-designed cap and trade system are really the same thing. And most economists would say there's not a dime's worth of difference between those two. It's just that carbon tax is somewhat simpler, I think, in the presentation. It's like, it's not, and that comes to me from some very exhaustive marketing research that I did back when Waxman-Markey was pending in Congress. I sat with my parents, who were both alive at that point, in their 80s, but we sat at the kitchen table where I grew up, and I explained cap and trade to the two of them. My dad, who's a retired industrial engineer, a really bright guy, says to me at the end of my explanation, "Bob, that won't work." And so I decided, if I can't convince these two people about the merits of cap and trade, I can't convince anybody, because it's pretty complicated. Carbon tax is a lot simpler, but I do acknowledge there's not much difference. And so if the EU goes forward with its carbon border adjustment, and they're using a cap and trade system or emission trading system, it can be fit in with a carbon tax here in America, or a carbon tax in Australia or Austria. Austria just announced that they're going to pursue a carbon tax. And so, but now, Karen, as to the California thing, the thing that's difficult about the California system is that we appreciate the fact they're a leading jurisdiction, and that they do lead the country quite often on environmental things. The problem is, though, they can't do a border adjustment as a state within the United States of America. And so figuring out how that would work is a little bit more complex, I think. It's why it is that state initiatives are usually exposed to a really vulnerable Achilles heel, which is that, you can't do this border adjustment as a state. If the state of Idaho or South Carolina says, we're going to tax carbon dioxide and you're going to pay on entry into Idaho or South Carolina, no can do. Only the federal government can impose those kind of tariffs. So that makes the California thing a little bit harder to figure out how it's going to fit. But let's hope that the idea of pricing in, which is what California has going, becomes nationwide in America. And when it does, then it'll fit well with what the EU is talking about.
Sebastian, we'll come back to you in just a minute, but we've got a question in chat from Eddie. He asked, what arguments have you heard, if any, against the particular proposal that you're advocating, the carbon tax? What are the opponents say about why it won't work or it's not a good idea?
Two big arguments. It's a great question, by the way. I really like the question, because what I used to do in Congress is when lobbyists would come, I'd say to them, what's the best argument against your position? And a good lobbyist, somebody that's really advocating for their position and knows their stuff, can tell you the best arguments on the other side. If they say to you, oh, there are not any good arguments on the other side, then you think, okay, you just lost credibility, because there are always good arguments on the other side. And so the arguments against this carbon tax, this pricing in, would be that, hey, how can people afford this? If price of gasoline now in South Carolina is up over $3, you're talking about a carbon tax that's, say, $25 a ton. that increases the price of gasoline by 21 cents a gallon at the pump, or say a $40 per ton price on carbon dioxide that you apply at the pipeline. You say, we know how much CO2 is going to be generated from burning this stuff that's passing this pipeline. We just taxed it at $40 per ton emitted. Well, that causes the price of gasoline to go up by 36 cents per gallon at the gas pump. It's about, you just move the decimal point over. It's about $40. It's almost 40 cents. It's actually turns out to be 36 cents. It's $25 per ton. Turns out to be 21 cents. So it's somewhere like just moving the decimal point over, and that's what you'd see at the local gas pump. And so that's a good argument against it, right? Is that who can afford that? And that's why I think you've got to. Another good, it's sort of the same argument, is it's therefore regressive. And if you know, as you know from Econ 101 that you might have taken, a regressive tax is one that harms poor people, one that hits them harder than wealthy people. And a carbon tax by itself is regrettably regressive. It hurts poor people, unless you do something with the money that helps them. And that's the key to it, is that you got to address. So the best argument against my position is Inglis. Your carbon tax is regressive. It hurts poor people. And who can afford this tax? My counter to that is, you're right. That's why we need to cut payroll taxes in equal amount, or dividend the money from the carbon tax back to the citizenry per capita. You do that, and you overcome that regressive impact, because now poor people who are paying right now 12.4% on the first dollar of income, if they're working a second job at McDonald's, they pay 12.4% in FICA taxes, 6.2 that shows up on their paycheck in the FICA box, 6.2 that doesn't show up on their check that McDonald's is paying. It's a total tax of 12.4%. It is a whopping tax on that income that they're making in that second job. You reduce that tax, you put on a carbon tax. The Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans do better. And so the argument against it is who can afford it. The counter is, yeah, but we're going to make it revenue neutral, and that's going to be better. Another good argument against what we're proposing is, Inglis, politically, it's just really hard. I say I'm talking to a Republican in Congress, and they look back at me and they say, we understand the philosophy that you're talking about here. We understand it's a good idea. But hey, man, it's like this. You expect me to go into Republican county convention and tell them that I'm for a carbon tax? And it's a good political argument. It's hard, and it takes a real education effort. And that's what we're about, what Citizens Climate Lobby is about, what Climate Leadership Council is about. All these are about, are out there trying to help people understand that, hey, this really is, makes sense, is the best way to do this. But it's a political argument. So it's the argument about regressivity and the argument about the politics of it that are probably the best arguments against our position.
We've got a couple of good follow-up questions in chat, and I'll ask them both together, and you can figure out the best way to respond. Christina, one of our students, asking, with raising gas prices through the tax, how does it affect everyday items? And would the federal minimum wage rise to make up the difference? And Trish observes that her senators in Idaho, that's Jim Risch and Mike Crapo, remain focused on the negative components of the carbon tax, that it will raise prices. And they ignore that Trish is in favor of the fee and dividend. How can we, as Idaho voters, get our senators, and I would add our members of the House, to see that we need both the fee and the dividend to protect consumer interests?
Yeah. Well, it's first part of that. It's very true that the price of gasoline going up means that the price of lots of things go up that are related to gasoline, to include the Amazon delivery package, right? Because the Amazon delivery person has to pay extra for gasoline if you do this carbon tax. And so they're going to want to pass that along to you in the delivery charge. And so, yes, the price of things go up. But again, if you've got a dividend check in your pocket, or you've got a reduction in your FICA taxes, you're okay, because then you're just paying for what you take. That's sort of the view here. What I'd say to the senators, particularly those two senators, is don't we conservatives believe this, that in the salad bar of life, take what you want, but pay for what you take? You can't let people walk off the end of that salad bar without paying. That's the free rider problem. And it's something that conservatives have always been really good at, is spotting the free rider and saying, no, that can't be. That cannot be. You cannot let people get away with free riding. Because if you do that, what happens in the salad bar case? You let some people just step off the end without paying based on weight. Well, you go back in 2 weeks and the sliced turkey will be gone, the olives will be gone, there won't be any cantaloupe on that salad bar. It'll be iceberg lettuce, Thousand Island dressing, and croutons. And that's all they're going to be able to put on that salad bar, because the restaurateur can't cover the cost otherwise. But if everybody pays based on weight, pay for what you take, then you can have that turkey slicing station, and you can have really nice salad bar, because people are paying for what they take. And so what I'd say to those two senators is, isn't that what we believe? In the salad bar of life, take what you want, but pay for what you take. And there's only so much of the atmosphere, only so much carbon dioxide that we can put up there into the trash dump of the sky. And just like we collect a tipping fee at the city dump in Moscow, if you're a trash hauler, you take trash to the city dump, they charge you based on the space that you're going to take up in that dump. And it's a conservative idea that progressives also agree with. Doesn't that make sense? Otherwise, English trash hauling is living off of the people of Moscow, right? Because, but if you charge me for dumping my truck stuff there, then you're able to, once the dump is filled up, to build another dump. And because it's a user fee, it's a pay-as-you-go system. It's accountability. It's conservatism, actually. It's what we conservatives deeply believe. And so, here's the thing, back to the argument against my position is, those two senators are worried that explanation that Inglis just took, that probably took 4 minutes, they don't have 4 minutes. They got a bumper sticker against them. And that's the challenge. And so the question is, do you think that we as Americans can be smart enough to do smart policy? Or do you think that, no, we were forever more captive to bumper sticker slogans? And that's an open question, I will tell you. It's an open question. Because here's what I learned after 12 years in Congress. Smart is hard, dumb is easy. Smart is really hard. If you want to do smart policy, it takes a lot of explaining. But you can tell people really dumb stuff, and they will stand in chairs and cheer for you as you tell them really stupid stuff, because they're used to hearing stupid stuff, and they're happy to hear it. But you tell them something that makes their head sort of hurt. But really, our choice here is, you can regulate it, you can incentivize it, or you can price it. Now, which do you want to do? And here's the problem. I'd also give a political response back to the political argument against my case is this. Hey, Mike Crapo, if the country decides that it's got a problem with climate change, it will take a liberal solution over nothing. And if you got nothing, they will take that other solution and they will be regulating. And we'll be at BMW telling them through a South Carolina engineer at South Carolina EPA how to paint the hood of that BMW. And that'll be a disaster. We got great engineers at South Carolina EPA, I'm sure, but they do not know how to paint a BMW better than BMW. And so what you want? You want to stand pat and do nothing and watch America choose the regulatory solution? Or do you want to get out there and try to explain what Milton Friedman would do in this case? Milton Friedman, the father of modern conservatism. So anyway, that's what I'd say back to that.
I know that several of our students have classes starting at the bottom of the hour, and if you need to leave, please excuse yourself now. But I think if the rest of you would like to keep going, we could go on till about 10:30 our time and 1:30 where Bob is on the East Coast. And I wanted to ask a question sort of about the political dimension of getting a carbon tax through Congress. On CNN this week, I heard an interview with John Curtis, congressman from Utah's 3rd District, is the chair of the Conservative Climate Caucus. And I looked at the list of members, and it looks like they are about 60 Republican members of the House have joined that caucus. And I wonder, Congressman, if you've had some conversations with Representative Curtis or some of the other leaders of that group, and is there some common ground between RepublicEn and the Conservative Climate Caucus? And can we expect them to come on board for the right piece of legislation?
Yeah, I'm very excited about what Representative Curtis is doing. We have a history with him. We teamed up with Citizens Climate Lobby when he was mayor of Provo, running for Congress, and did a field trip with him with some BYU professors. You can see it on our website, RepublicEn.org, under the blog post. You'll see it. Anyway, so way back then, he was concerned about climate, and he has carried that concern now into establishing this Conservative Climate Caucus. I think that I read from something that he wrote that he's in Glasgow or will be there shortly. It's really, really important work that he's doing. And so as to whether they'll come immediately and quickly to the solution that I've been advocating here, Kenton, I think that may take a little bit longer, but they are making progress toward educating members of Congress about the realities. You can regulate it, you can incentivize it, or you can price in the negative effects. So I'm encouraged about what they might accomplish. And some people would say, well, it's window dressing or greenwashing for some of those people on that list. That's probably true. For some of them it is, but not for John Curtis. His heart and head are in the same place. He's trying to figure out a solution here, and I know that from really great interactions with him.
Christina had a follow-up on the carbon tax, and she wonders how would this tax encourage or discourage the striking of truckers? And she recalls that a number of truckers decided to strike after the last increase in fuel taxes. Is there a way to keep our commerce moving on these long-haul truckers and not to price those drivers out of their jobs?
Yeah, I think that what it means is that we've got to, there has to be a way for for them to be paid for any costs that they incur, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. Do you remember when gasoline hit $4 a gallon, Federal Express and UPS were charging a delivery surcharge on their packages? And that, from my perspective, is completely appropriate. You know, if you want Amazon coming to your house every day, go right ahead. I'm for you. It's freedom. And you can have them come to your house every day. But you should expect them to charge you for the fuel costs that they're experiencing. It might cause you to choose an Amazon delivery day, in which case they come just one day a week to your house. And you see, that sets the incentives up right. Amazon deserves to be paid for delivering to your house. And you should be free to choose whether you want it daily or whether you want it once a week. And if you want it once a week, you can save money. And that's great. Sets up the right incentives. Back to that salad bar thing. Pay for take all the Amazon deliveries you want. Just pay for what you take. And it makes sense. It makes the world go around the right way, because then you have people regulating their own appetites rather than the government trying to step in to regulate your appetite. And that, as we were talking about earlier, is an inefficient way to do it from our perspective, because it involves regulations and regulators and government sedans rolling past your house. I mean, it gets pretty cumbersome.
In your opening remarks, you talked about your trip to Antarctica and how that was influential in changing your mind about human-caused climate change. And nobody asked about it. And I've heard the story before, but I'd love to hear it again about the influence of seeing firsthand the effects of global warming and how that caused you to perhaps rethink your own approach to it.
Yeah. So here's what it is. It's ice core drillings. It's really pretty simple. With an amazing fun fact to know and tell, the South Pole is a desert. It gets 1/4 of an inch of precipitation a year. It's 10,000 feet above sea level at the South Pole. That's 5,000 feet of ice on top of 5,000 feet of dirt. So in the 5,000 feet of ice, if you only get it 1/4 of an inch a year, you get an amazing record of the Earth's atmosphere, because the gas levels are trapped in that ice. And so the scientists simply drill down through the ice, pull up a core, put it in coolers, fly it off to the Bird Polar Research Center at Ohio State. And then they study the ice. And what it shows is stable levels of CO2, and then this uptick that coincides with the Industrial Revolution when we started burning fossil fuels. And if you go to our website, by the way, RepublicEn.org, there's a wonderful infographic from Bloomberg Business Week that shows observed temperature rise, and then it shows possible explanations. Volcanic activity, you'll see it doesn't correlate. Sunspot activity, or emissions from the sun, doesn't correlate. You see aerosols, they don't correlate. The thing that correlates nearly perfectly is a CO2 level, and that those observations are from those ice core drillings. And so that's what I saw in Antarctica. Also, the thing that your students need to know, Kenton, is that they too can go to Antarctica. 2 ways to get there. One is to be a scientist. Okay, that can be hard for people like me that aren't so great at math, right? But the other way is to work on the work crew down there. And so our son graduated from college, and I said this to him, and he applied and went to Antarctica as a welder. So he was welding in Antarctica for their summer, our winter. So it's a really cool thing to do. It's also cool, as in cold. But if you live in Moscow, Idaho, you're sort of used to that. So it's a really neat thing to do if you want to try that out.
And as Karen and Trish know, the University of Idaho has been directly involved in Antarctic research in the 90s and early 2000s. And I know several people who live here now who had extended tours in Antarctica. And
Wow.
so, as you say, it's possible to go and see firsthand.
Yeah, it's really neat. I knew it'd be interesting scenery and great science, but I didn't know as a people would be so interesting, because what you had is PhDs in the dish room washing dishes, and then they'd come out and listen to the scientific presentation that night because they went there to wash dishes just to get to Antarctica. And so really pretty awesome people down there. It's really interesting folks that end up in Antarctica for a summer, an austral summer, our winter.
On that note, I think we've reached the end of our time together, but it's been terrific having you with us virtually. And I hope that the next time we see each other, it'll be across the table or in an auditorium here on campus. And so if those who are still with us, if you could either put up your hands with the camera on, or just a single hand up in the Zoom signal to show our appreciation. This is, as always, a good chance to catch up, and we'll check in with you again as our spring schedules develop, and we'll be watching those COVID rates plateau and decline, and see if it's going to be possible to have you physically here in the spring.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Kenton. Great to see you. And Karen and Mac and all of you, thanks so much.
Thanks, Bob. That's
See
great.
ya.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.